My family abandoned me and left me alone, but after I got back on my feet, they asked me for help and want me back. My name is Karen, and I need to tell you something that happened when I was 17. Something that changed everything about who I thought I was and what family meant. I remember that Tuesday in October like it was yesterday. I'd just finished my shift at the local coffee shop where I worked part-time after school. My backpack was heavy with textbooks, and I was already mentally preparing for the chemistry test I had the next day. The autumn air was crisp, and I could smell wood smoke from someone's fireplace as I walked up our street. Our house looked different somehow as I approached. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but something felt off. The curtains were drawn tight, which was unusual because Mom always liked natural light. The porch light wasn't on either, even though it was getting dark. I fumbled with my keys at the front door, juggling my backpack and the leftover pastries I'd brought home from work. When I finally got inside, the silence hit me like a physical blow. Not the comfortable quiet of an empty house, but something heavier. Something final. Mom? Dad? Alex? I called out, dropping my bag by the door. No answer. The echo of my own voice seemed to mock me. That's when I noticed the furniture was gone. Not all of it, but the important pieces. The family photos that usually lined the hallway table had vanished. Mom's favorite armchair wasn't in its usual spot by the window. The coffee table where we played board games on Sunday nights was missing. My heart started racing as I ran through the house, checking every room. My parents' bedroom was completely empty. My brother Alex's room looked like it had been cleaned out in a hurry. His posters were torn down, leaving tape marks on the walls, and his closet doors hung open, revealing nothing but empty hangers. But my room was untouched. Everything exactly as I'd left it that morning. My bed was still unmade, my homework scattered across my desk, my clothes in a pile on the chair where I'd thrown them the night before. In the kitchen, I found it. A single piece of paper on the counter, folded in half with my name written on the outside in my mother's careful handwriting. My hands shook as I unfolded it. Karen, you're old enough now to take care of yourself. We've moved somewhere smaller and can't take you with us. You'll figure it out, you always do. The rent is paid through the end of the month. After that, you're on your own. Don't try to find us. That was it. 17 years of what I thought was love, reduced to 4 sentences. No explanation, no goodbye, no forwarding address. Just, you'll figure it out. Like I was a math problem they'd grown tired of solving. I read that note probably 50 times that first night, sitting on the kitchen floor, hoping I'd misunderstood something, hoping it was some kind of cruel joke. But their absence spoke louder than any words could. The house felt enormous and suffocating at the same time. Every creak of the floorboards made me jump, expecting to hear familiar voices that would never come home again. I called my parents' cell phones until the numbers were disconnected. I tried Alex's phone, but it went straight to voicemail. A generic recording, not his voice. They had erased me from their lives as methodically as they had packed their belongings. As I sat there in that empty house, something inside me shifted. The scared 17-year-old girl who had walked through that door expecting dinner and help with homework was gone. In her place was someone harder, someone who understood that the world was far crueler than she'd ever imagined. I had exactly 3 weeks before I'd be homeless. 3 weeks to figure out how to survive in a world that had just taught me the most brutal lesson of all. That even the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally can abandon you without looking back. That night, I didn't cry. I couldn't. The shock was too deep, the betrayal too complete. Instead, I sat in that kitchen until sunrise, staring at that note and planning my next move. Because if there's one thing I learned in that moment, it's that when everyone abandons you, the only person you can count on is yourself. The first week was the hardest. I kept going to school like nothing had happened, partly because I didn't know what else to do, and partly because school was the only normal thing left in my life. I'd come home to that increasingly empty house and try to do homework by the light of the single lamp they'd left behind. When the electricity got cut off on day 8, reality hit me like a sledgehammer. I had about $60 in my savings account, and whatever cash I could scrape together from my coffee shop job. It wasn't enough for a deposit on even the cheapest apartment in town. That's when I discovered the storage units behind Miller's Hardware. The owner, an elderly man named Frank, had a section of older units that weren't climate-controlled. They were cheaper to rent, and he didn't ask too many questions when I paid cash for a month up front. Unit 47 became my bedroom. It was 8 feet by 10 feet of concrete walls and a corrugated metal door. I bought a sleeping bag from the thrift store and learned to arrange cardboard boxes as furniture. It wasn't home, but it was shelter, and it was mine. The hardest part was staying clean. I couldn't afford a gym membership, so I got creative. The community center downtown had public restrooms with sinks, and if I timed it right during their busy hours, I could wash my hair and brush my teeth without anyone noticing. I bought baby wipes in bulk and learned to give myself what I called truck stop showers in bathroom stalls. Food was an even bigger challenge. I'd always taken for granted that there would be something in the refrigerator when I got hungry. Now, every meal required strategy. I survived mostly on peanut butter sandwiches, bananas, and whatever day-old pastries I could bring home from the coffee shop. My manager, Katie, started accidentally making extra sandwiches that needed to be thrown away, which somehow always ended up in a bag with my name on it. The worst part wasn't the discomfort or the hunger. It was the invisibility. People walked past my storage unit every day, completely unaware that a 17-year-old girl was living inside. Teachers at school asked if I was feeling okay because I looked tired. But when I said I was fine, they believed me because it was easier than digging deeper. I became an expert at looking normal. I kept my school clothes in my locker and changed in the bathroom every morning. I volunteered to help with after-school activities just to have somewhere warm to be. I studied in the library until closing time, not because I was particularly studious, but because it delayed the moment when I'd have to return to that concrete box. One night, about 2 weeks into my new reality, I was lying on that thin sleeping bag, listening to the rain hammer against the metal door, when something inside me broke open. Not in a bad way, but like a shell cracking to let something new emerge. I realized that I was surviving. More than that, I was adapting. I started making lists in a notebook I'd found in my locker. Things I needed. Things I wanted to accomplish. Places where I could shower for free. Restaurants that threw away good food at closing time. I mapped out every public bathroom in a 5-mile radius, rating them by cleanliness and privacy. Most importantly, I started paying attention to how other people managed to thrive when they had so little. I watched the homeless man who always seemed to have clean clothes and 3 meals a day, and learned he volunteered at the church kitchen in exchange for food and laundry privileges. I observed the single mothers at the community center who juggled school, work, and kids, and noted how they shared resources and information. After 3 weeks in that storage unit, I felt like I'd earned a master's degree in survival. I knew which gas stations had the cleanest bathrooms, which restaurants were most likely to hire someone underage, and which social services would help without asking too many questions about where I lived. The funny thing was, I started to feel proud of myself. Not proud of the situation, but proud of how I was handling it. Every morning that I woke up in that metal box, got dressed, and walked into school looking like any other teenager was a small victory. Every night I managed to find enough food to keep going was proof that I was stronger than anyone had given me credit for. I was learning something my parents had never taught me, that dignity doesn't come from where you sleep or what you eat. It comes from refusing to let circumstances destroy your sense of self. And despite everything they'd taken from me, they couldn't take that. After living in that storage unit for a month, I knew I needed something more stable. The night shifts at Riverside Diner became available when their regular cook quit without notice, and I convinced the owner, Maria Santos, to give me a chance despite being 17. "You sure you can handle this, kid?" Maria asked, looking me up and down skeptically. "Night shift means 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., 4 nights a week. It's not glamorous work." I almost laughed. Glamorous was the last thing I was worried about. "I can handle it," I told her. And I meant every word. The work was exactly what I needed. While other teenagers were sleeping in warm beds, I was flipping burgers, washing dishes, and cleaning tables for truckers, night shift workers, and the occasional drunk college student. The pay was minimum wage, but Maria let me eat 1 meal per shift, which solved my biggest problem. More importantly, the diner was warm, well-lit, and had clean bathrooms. I could do homework during slow periods, and Maria didn't mind if I used the employee shower in the back after my shift ended. She never asked why I needed to shower at work, and I never offered to explain. The other night shift workers became my unlikely family. There was Roberto, a guy in his 30s who worked construction during the day and sent money to his family in Mexico. Carmen, a nursing student who needed the flexible schedule. And Big Jim, a former trucker who told stories that could make you laugh until your sides hurt. They all had their reasons for working nights, and none of them asked too many questions about mine. When I mentioned I was between apartments, Carmen offered to let me crash on her couch, but I politely declined. I'd learned that accepting help always came with strings attached, even from well-meaning people. What I did accept was their knowledge. Roberto taught me how to negotiate with landlords and utility companies. Carmen showed me which community college courses I could take for almost nothing. Big Jim explained how to build credit from scratch and why having documentation of everything was crucial. "Life's gonna try to knock you down, Karen," Big Jim told me one quiet Tuesday night as we cleaned the grill. "The difference between people who make it and people who don't isn't where they start. It's whether they get back up smarter than when they fell." I was getting smarter. Every shift taught me something new about business, about people, about how money flowed through the world. I watched Maria manage inventory, handle difficult customers, and balance the books. I paid attention to which menu items had the highest profit margins and which suppliers gave her the best deals. During my breaks, I'd study not just for school, but for life. I read books about personal finance from the library, researched different career paths, and started making plans that extended beyond just surviving each day. I opened a bank account with my first paycheck and started saving every penny I could. The storage unit began to feel less like a desperate measure and more like a strategic choice. I wasn't paying rent to a landlord who could evict me on a whim. I wasn't dealing with roommates or nosy neighbors. It was mine, and I controlled every aspect of my small space. I bought a small battery-powered lantern and some plastic storage containers to organize my belongings. I found a folding table at a yard sale that I could use as a desk. Slowly, methodically, I was building something that belonged to me. School became easier to navigate once I had a steady income and regular meals. My grades, which had dipped during those first chaotic weeks, began to improve. Teachers started noticing me again, but for the right reasons this time. When my guidance counselor, Mrs. Patterson, called me into her office to discuss college applications, I was ready. "Karen, your grades have really turned around this semester," she said, looking at my transcript. "Have you thought about your plans after graduation?" "Every day," I replied. And I had. While my classmates worried about prom themes and weekend parties, I was calculating the cost of community college tuition and researching which degrees offered the best return on investment. I'd learned something my parents never taught me, that work wasn't a punishment or a burden. It was freedom. Every hour I spent at that diner was an hour I spent building my independence, my skills, and my future. Every dollar I earned was proof that I didn't need anyone to take care of me. The 17-year-old girl who had found that cruel note 6 months earlier was gone. In her place was someone who understood that respect isn't given freely. It's earned through consistency, reliability, and results. And I was earning mine, one night shift at a time. 12 years later, I was standing in the penthouse office of my third successful business, looking out at the city skyline, when my assistant knocked on the door. "Karen, there's a Forbes reporter here for your interview," she said. I'd built my empire systematically, the same way I'd survived in that storage unit, one careful step at a time. After graduating high school, I'd used my savings to enroll in community college business courses while continuing to work nights. I studied every successful entrepreneur I could find, analyzing their strategies and mistakes. My first business was simple: a cleaning service for office buildings. I knew how to work hard, how to be reliable, and how to stay invisible when necessary. I started with one small building, working before dawn while studying for classes. Within 6 months, I had 3 employees and 5 contracts. I sold that business 2 years later for enough profit to start my second venture, a logistics company that helped small restaurants streamline their supply chains. I understood food service from my diner days, and I'd learned to spot inefficiencies others missed. That business grew from my studio apartment to a warehouse to 3 locations across 2 states. By age 29, I'd sold the logistics company and launched my current enterprise, a consulting firm that helped overlooked entrepreneurs access capital and resources. We specialized in people like I'd been, those who didn't have family money or connections, but had vision and determination. The Forbes article called me the self-made millionaire who started with nothing. They wanted to know my secret, my inspiration, my family support system. I gave them the sanitized version: challenging childhood, learned independence early, turned obstacles into opportunities. I never mentioned the storage unit or the note that changed everything. Some stories are too raw for public consumption. But success, I'd discovered, tastes different when you've earned it completely alone. Every milestone felt simultaneously like a victory and a reminder of what was missing. When I bought my first house, there was no one to call with the news. When my company won its first major award, I sat in the ceremony audience surrounded by entrepreneurs celebrating with their families, and I felt the absence like a physical ache. I'd built something impressive, something valuable, something entirely mine. I had a beautiful home, financial security, and professional respect. I employed 43 people and had helped launch hundreds of small businesses. I should have felt proud, fulfilled, complete. Instead, I felt hollow. Success achieved in isolation has a strange quality. It's both more meaningful and less satisfying than it should be. Every achievement was proof of my capability, but also evidence of how much I'd had to overcome that others took for granted. I'd learned to compartmentalize the loneliness. I dated occasionally, but relationships felt complicated when your origin story involved being abandoned by everyone who was supposed to love you unconditionally. I had colleagues I respected and employees I cared about, but maintaining professional boundaries meant never getting too close. The Forbes photographer wanted shots of me in my office, my home, my car. They wanted to capture the lifestyle of success, but they couldn't photograph what was really different about my success: the fact that I'd built it entirely for myself, with no one to share it with, no one who remembered where I'd started. Late that night, after the interview was finished, I sat in my home office looking at the financial statements that proved my worth on paper. 7 figures in the bank, property in 3 states, a business valued at more than most people would see in several lifetimes. I thought about that 17-year-old girl in the storage unit, making lists by battery-powered lantern light. She would be amazed by how far we'd come. She would be proud of what we'd accomplished. But I also wondered what she would think about how quiet this success was, how solitary. In all her planning and dreaming, she'd focused on building security and independence. She'd never considered what it would feel like to achieve everything you'd hoped for, with no one around to witness it or celebrate it with you. The bitter irony wasn't lost on me. I'd become extraordinarily successful at taking care of myself because I'd had no choice. But that same self-reliance that had saved me had also isolated me. I was living proof that you could survive anything and thrive beyond your wildest dreams. I just hadn't expected success to feel so much like being in that storage unit all over again. Safe, secure, but fundamentally alone. The Facebook message arrived on a Tuesday morning, exactly 12 years to the day since I'd found that note in the kitchen. I'd been reviewing quarterly reports when my personal phone buzzed with a notification from someone named Alex Mitchell. The profile picture made my stomach drop. It was my brother, older and broader than the 18-year-old I remembered, but unmistakably Alex. The message was brief. Karen, I know this is unexpected, but I saw your interview in Forbes. I'm proud of what you've accomplished. I'd really like to talk. I know we have a lot to discuss about what happened when we were younger. Would you be willing to meet for coffee? I stared at that message for 20 minutes. My coffee growing cold as my hands shook. 12 years of silence. And now, suddenly, after I'd been featured in a national business magazine, my brother wanted to reconnect. The timing wasn't coincidental. The Forbes article had generated significant media attention. I'd been invited to speak at conferences, other publications wanted interviews, and my consulting firm had received dozens of new client inquiries. My success was now public knowledge, complete with photos of my home and estimates of my net worth. I showed the message to my business partner, David, the one person who knew the full story of my past. What do you want to do? He asked carefully. I want to know what they want, I replied. Because after 12 years of nothing, they don't suddenly miss my sparkling personality. I agreed to meet Alex at a neutral location, a coffee shop downtown that I chose specifically because it was public, well-lit, and far from anywhere that held memories. I arrived 15 minutes early and positioned myself at a table with a clear view of the entrance. Alex walked in exactly on time, and my first thought was how much he looked like our father. Same jawline, same way of scanning a room before committing to entering it fully. He'd put on weight, and his hairline had receded, but he carried himself with a confidence I didn't remember from our teenage years. Karen, he said, approaching my table with a smile that seemed rehearsed. You look amazing. Success suits you. I didn't stand up or offer a hug. Alex, you look... I paused, studying his face. Older. He laughed nervously and sat down across from me. 12 years will do that. I can't believe how well you've done for yourself. That Forbes article was incredible. There it was. The reference to my public success within the first minute of conversation. I leaned back in my chair and waited for him to continue. I've thought about reaching out so many times over the years, he said, fidgeting with his coffee cup. But I never knew what to say. We were all so young when everything happened. You were 21, Alex. Hardly a child. His face flushed slightly. You're right. Things were complicated. You have to understand. Mom and Dad were going through a really rough time financially. The house was in foreclosure. Dad had lost his job, and they felt like they had no choice. I studied his expression as he spoke. He'd prepared this explanation, practiced it. But there were cracks in his composure, the way his eyes darted away when he mentioned our parents, the slight tremor in his voice when he said, no choice. So they had no choice but to abandon their 17-year-old daughter, I asked quietly. It wasn't like that. We thought you'd be okay. You were always so independent, so capable. Even as a kid, you figured things out. The absurdity of his justification almost made me laugh. So I was abandoned because I was competent? Karen, please. I know it sounds terrible now, but we were desperate. And look how well you turned out. Maybe it was meant to happen this way. I felt something cold settle in my chest. This was what he'd come to say. That my abandonment had been a favor. That my success justified their cruelty. That I should be grateful for the character-building experience of homelessness at 17. Why now, Alex? I asked directly. Why reach out now after 12 years of silence? He shifted uncomfortably. I've been going through some changes. Divorce, job situation, you know. It made me realize how important family is. How much I've missed having you in my life. There it was. The truth hiding behind the sentiment. He was having financial problems and remembered that his successful sister might be useful. I stood up from the table. I'm going to think about what you've said, Alex. This is a lot to process. Of course, he said quickly, also standing. Can I give you my number? Maybe we could have dinner next week, somewhere nice. My treat. His treat. With what money, I wondered, if he was going through a job situation. I took his business card, noticed it was slightly worn at the edges, and promised to call him soon. As I walked to my car, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not anger or hurt, but a clinical curiosity about what exactly my family thought they could gain from me now. That evening, I hired a private investigator. I wanted to know everything about their lives over the past 12 years, their current financial situations, and most importantly, what had triggered this sudden desire for reconciliation. Knowledge, I'd learned, was the most valuable currency in any negotiation, and this reunion was definitely going to be a negotiation. The investigator's report arrived 3 days later, and it painted a clearer picture of my family's motivations than Alex's coffee shop performance had. Alex was indeed going through a divorce, his second one, and had been unemployed for 8 months. He'd burned through his 401k and was facing foreclosure on his house. My parents were in even worse shape. Dad had been forced into early retirement due to health issues, and Mom was working part-time at a retail store. They'd refinanced their house twice and were drowning in credit card debt. Most interesting was the timeline. Alex had reached out to me exactly 1 week after the Forbes article was published online, and 2 days after my parents had called him asking if he'd seen it. I called Alex back and suggested we have that dinner he'd mentioned. I chose an upscale steakhouse, partly to see how he'd react to the prices, and partly because I wanted him uncomfortable. Alex arrived wearing a suit that had seen better days and spent the first 10 minutes talking about how nice the restaurant was, in a way that made it clear he couldn't afford it. He ordered the cheapest entree on the menu and declined drinks, claiming he was trying to be healthier. I let him maintain the pretense through appetizers and small talk about his kids, his ex-wife, the challenges of the job market. He was working up to something, and I wanted to hear him say it himself. "Karen," he finally began as our main courses arrived, "I need to be honest with you about something. Part of why I wanted to reconnect is because I'm going through a really tough time financially." I cut a piece of my steak and waited. "I know this is awkward, but I was wondering if you might be able to help me out temporarily, just until I get back on my feet. I wouldn't ask if I wasn't desperate." "How much?" I asked calmly. His eyes lit up with hope. "Well, I'm behind on my mortgage by about $8,000, and if I could just catch up, I could probably refinance and lower my payments. It would make all the difference." $8,000. To him, it was salvation. To me, it was less than I spent on business lunches in a quarter. But it wasn't about the money. "Alex, can I ask you something? Do you remember what you told me when I was 17 and needed help?" His face flushed. "Karen, that was different. I was just a kid myself, and you told me I'd figure it out because I always did. You watched our parents abandon me and said nothing. You packed up your room and left without even saying goodbye. I was 21 and broke. I didn't have a choice. You had choices. You could have taken me with you. You could have helped me find somewhere to live. You could have at least warned me what was coming." I set down my fork and looked at him directly. "But you didn't do any of those things because it would have been inconvenient for you. That's not fair. You don't know what it was like for me, watching the family fall apart. You're right. I don't know what it was like for you because you disappeared along with everyone else. But I do know what it was like to be 17 and homeless because the people who were supposed to protect me decided I was disposable." Alex's jaw tightened. "I came here to apologize, to try to make things right. I thought you'd understand that people make mistakes when they're under pressure." "Oh, I understand pressure, Alex. I understand it better than most people. What I don't understand is why your current pressure should be my problem to solve." "Because we're family," he said, his voice rising slightly. "Because blood means something." I almost laughed. Blood means something? Where was that philosophy 12 years ago? "Karen, please. I know I screwed up, but I can't change the past. I can only try to do better now. My kids are going to lose their home if I can't figure this out." There it was, the manipulation I'd been waiting for. Bringing the children into it, making me responsible for their welfare if I refused to help him. I signaled for the check. "Alex, your children losing their home would be tragic, but it wouldn't be because I refused to bail you out. It would be because their father made poor financial decisions and is now trying to manipulate his abandoned sister into solving problems he created." "That's cold, Karen. Even for you." "Cold?" I repeated, pulling out my credit card. "You know what's cold, Alex? Leaving a 17-year-old to fend for herself because it's financially convenient? What I'm being is consistent. You taught me that family members aren't responsible for each other's survival. I learned that lesson very well." As I signed the check, Alex made one last attempt. "Mom and Dad want to see you too. They miss you." I looked at him for a long moment. Do they? Or do they miss the idea of having a daughter who might be useful to them now? His silence was answer enough. I left him sitting at that table with a check for his own meal, and a clearer understanding of exactly how successful his guilt trip had been. Some lessons, once learned, can't be unlearned, and I'd learned a long time ago that when people show you who they are, you should believe them the first time. 2 weeks after the disastrous dinner with Alex, my mother called my office directly. She must have gotten the number from my company website, because she bypassed my assistant and somehow reached my personal line. "Karen?" The voice was older, more tentative than I remembered, but unmistakably hers. "It's Mom." I'd been reviewing contracts when the phone rang. Now I set down my pen and leaned back in my chair, surprised by how calm I felt. "Hello, Linda." I used her first name deliberately. She'd forfeited the title of Mom 12 years ago. "Oh, honey, it's so good to hear your voice. Alex told me you two had dinner. He said it didn't go very well." "That depends on your perspective. I thought it was quite illuminating." There was a pause. "Karen, I know you're angry with us. You have every right to be. But I was hoping we could talk, just you and me. There's so much I need to explain." "Explain away. I have a few minutes." "Not over the phone. Could we meet somewhere? Please? I know I don't deserve it, but I'm asking anyway." Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet her for lunch the next day. I chose a restaurant near my office, somewhere I could easily leave if necessary. She was already seated when I arrived, looking smaller and grayer than I'd expected. The woman who had once seemed so formidable now appeared fragile, almost nervous. She stood when she saw me, hesitating as if she wanted to hug me, then sitting back down when I made no move toward her. "You look wonderful," she said, her eyes taking in my tailored suit and confident posture. So professional, so successful. I ordered a salad and water, making it clear this wouldn't be a long meal. She fidgeted with her menu, ordering soup she barely touched. "Karen, I need you to know that leaving you wasn't easy for us. It was the hardest decision your father and I ever made." "Was it?" I asked. "Because the note you left made it sound pretty straightforward." Her face crumpled slightly. "That note, I rewrote it so many times. I didn't know how to explain something that I didn't fully understand myself. Try now. You've had 12 years to figure out how to explain abandoning your minor child." She took a shaky breath. "We were drowning, Karen. Your father had been out of work for almost a year. We'd maxed out every credit card, borrowed against the house twice. The bank was starting foreclosure proceedings." I waited, letting her continue. "We couldn't afford to feed 3 people anymore. We could barely afford 2. When your father finally got that job offer in Phoenix, it was for housing, but just a 1-bedroom company apartment. We couldn't take you with us, even if we'd wanted to." "Even if you'd wanted to," I repeated. She flinched. "That came out wrong. Of course we wanted to take you. But you were almost 18. You had a job. You were so capable. We thought—" "You thought what, exactly?" "We thought you'd figure it out. You were always the smartest one, the most resourceful. Even as a little girl, you solved problems the rest of us couldn't." I set down my fork, processing her words. "So you abandoned me because I was competent?" "We didn't abandon you. We made an impossible choice. We couldn't take care of all 3 of us, so we tried to save who we could. And you decided I was expendable." "No!" She leaned forward, her eyes filling with tears. "We decided you were strong enough to survive. And we were right, weren't we? Look at what you've accomplished." The rationalization was breathtaking in its selfishness. They'd convinced themselves that abandoning me was somehow a gift, that forcing me into homelessness had been an act of faith in my abilities, rather than a betrayal of their responsibilities. "Linda, let me ask you something, and I want a completely honest answer. If I had failed, if I'd ended up dead or addicted or in prison, would you have felt responsible?" She was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "We told ourselves you'd be fine. We had to believe that, or we couldn't have done it. That's not what I asked. I asked if you would have felt responsible if I hadn't survived." Her silence stretched between us like a chasm. Finally, she looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, we would have. But Karen, we didn't have any good choices. We had $3,000 to our name and a week to get out of the house before the sheriff came to evict us. Your father's new job paid just enough to keep us alive, not to support 3 people. We were choosing which one of us would suffer. And we chose ourselves." I stared at her, processing this admission. "You chose yourselves. At least that's honest. We chose to keep the family together. Minus one person who we believed could survive on her own." "The family?" I repeated slowly. "You mean you, Dad, and Alex? I wasn't part of the family you were trying to keep together. That's not—" She stopped herself, realizing that was exactly what she'd said. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly. You had enough money to relocate 3 people, but not enough to support 3 people. So instead of all of you struggling together, you decided that I should struggle alone while the 3 of you stayed comfortable. It wasn't comfortable, Karen. That apartment was tiny, and your father's hours were terrible. But you had a roof, and food, and each other." She nodded, tears flowing freely now. "And in 12 years, not one of you thought to check if I was alive. Not a phone call, not a letter, not even a Google search to see if I'd ended up in jail or dead. We were afraid," she admitted. "Afraid you'd hate us. Afraid of what we might find. So you chose ignorance over responsibility. We chose to believe you were okay because the alternative was unbearable." I leaned back in my chair, studying this woman who had given birth to me but had never truly been my mother. The tears, the guilt, the justifications, none of it changed the fundamental math of what they'd done. "Linda, can I tell you what really happened after you left?" She nodded, bracing herself. "I lived in a storage unit for 6 months. I showered in gas station bathrooms and ate peanut butter sandwiches for dinner, because that's all I could afford. I worked night shifts at a diner while finishing high school, and I studied by battery-powered lantern light because I couldn't afford electricity." Her face went white. "Karen, I had no idea. You had no idea because you chose not to know. You weren't concerned with the reality of my situation, only with maintaining your fantasy that abandoning me had been a difficult but necessary choice. You thought wrong. But here's the thing, Linda. You were also right about one thing. I did figure it out. I survived, and I thrived, and I built something extraordinary, but not because of your faith in my abilities. I succeeded in spite of your betrayal." I stood to leave, but she grabbed my wrist. Karen, please, we need you. Your father's health is failing, we're drowning in medical bills, and I looked down at her hand on my arm, then back at her face. And now you need me. How convenient. We're family, she said desperately. No, Linda. We're biologically related. Family is something else entirely. Family doesn't abandon each other when times get hard. Family doesn't disappear for 12 years and reappear only when they need something. I gently removed her hand from my arm. You made your choice 12 years ago. You chose to save yourselves and sacrifice me. Now I'm making my choice. I choose to save myself and let you handle your own problems. As I walked away from that table, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not anger, not satisfaction, but a profound sense of closure. The woman crying behind me was a stranger who happened to share my DNA. The people who had raised me, taught me, shaped me into who I became, were the night shift workers at the diner, the teachers who stayed late to help, the strangers who had shown me small kindnesses when I needed them most. My real family was the one I'd built myself, one relationship at a time, with people who chose to love me not because they had to, but because they wanted to. The smear campaign began 2 weeks after my lunch with Linda. It started subtly. A former high school classmate mentioned that she'd heard I'd had some troubles as a teenager and had run away from home. Then my business partner David forwarded me a screenshot of a Facebook post from someone claiming to be my former neighbor, saying they remembered when I'd stolen money from my parents and disappeared. By the end of the month, the narrative had crystallized into something grotesque but believable. I was an ungrateful daughter who had robbed her struggling family and run away, leaving my poor parents heartbroken and financially devastated. The story painted them as victims of their own child's selfishness and criminality. The private investigator I'd used before proved invaluable in tracking the source of these rumors. It was Alex, working in coordination with my parents, systematically contacting anyone they could find from my past to spread this fabricated version of events. They were crafting a story that served multiple purposes. It explained my 12-year absence in a way that made them sympathetic figures. It preemptively discredited any version of events I might share, and it positioned them as the wronged parties, making any refusal to help them look like continued cruelty from their victimizer. The most insidious part was how reasonable their story sounded to people who didn't know the truth. Troubled teenager steals from family and runs away? It happened every day. Successful adult who won't help her struggling parents? That looked like selfishness, especially when the parents were elderly and facing medical bills. I was in my office when my assistant brought me a particularly nasty email from a potential client who had heard some disturbing things about my character and was withdrawing their business. That's when I realized this wasn't just personal vindictiveness. It was an attack on my professional reputation. That evening, I called a meeting with my legal team. I laid out the situation clearly. My biological family was conducting a deliberate campaign to destroy my reputation because I'd refused to give them money. Do we have grounds for defamation suits? I asked my attorney, Rachel. Potentially, but it would be difficult to prove damages, and it might generate more publicity than you want, she replied. The real question is what you want to achieve. Do you want them to stop? Or do you want to clear your name publicly? Both. Then we need evidence, documentation, proof of what really happened 12 years ago. That's when I realized I'd kept everything. The note my parents left, photos of the storage unit I'd lived in, pay stubs from the diner, school records showing my address changes. I'd saved it all, not out of sentimentality, but because I'd learned early that documentation was protection. More importantly, I had witnesses. Maria from the diner was still alive and remembered me clearly. My high school guidance counselor, Mrs. Patterson, had kept detailed notes about students in crisis. The community center where I'd showered had security footage archives that might still exist. But the most damaging evidence came from an unexpected source. My brother Alex had been posting on social media about his financial struggles for months, creating a clear timeline that contradicted their victim narrative. His own Facebook post showed him asking for money from various relatives, mentioning his parents' financial problems, and bragging about reaching out to his successful sister long before he'd actually contacted me. I compiled everything into a comprehensive file and had my attorney send cease and desist letters to Alex and my parents. The message was clear: stop spreading lies, or face legal consequences with evidence that would expose them completely. But I also did something else. I started telling my real story to people who mattered. Not publicly, not dramatically, but quietly, to the colleagues and clients who had heard the rumors. I shared the documentation with a few key people, letting them draw their own conclusions. The truth, I discovered, was more powerful than fiction. When people saw the actual note my parents had left, the photos of where I'd lived, the timeline of events supported by documentation, the lies fell apart. More importantly, my professional reputation spoke for itself. 12 years of ethical business practices, reliable service, and genuine relationships carried more weight than gossip from people no one had ever met. Within a month, the Whisper campaign had backfired spectacularly. Instead of destroying my credibility, it had highlighted my resilience. Instead of making me look like a selfish daughter, it made me look like someone who had overcome extraordinary circumstances to build something meaningful. The final irony was that their lies had inadvertently advertised my success story. Several new clients approached me specifically because they'd heard I'd built my business from nothing and wanted to work with someone who understood real struggle. As I sat in my office looking at the stack of new contracts, I realized that my family had given me one final gift. They'd taught me that my reputation was strong enough to survive their worst intentions. They'd tested my foundations and found them solid. They'd also revealed something crucial about themselves. When decent people can't get what they want through honest means, they accept disappointment and move on. When toxic people can't get what they want through manipulation, they escalate to destruction. The people who had abandoned me at 17 were now trying to destroy me at 29. The consistency was almost admirable. The escalation came exactly as I'd predicted. When the cease and desist letters stopped the social media campaign, and when it became clear that their reputation destruction had backfired, my family moved to direct confrontation. It started with Alex showing up at my office building. My security called to inform me that someone claiming to be my brother was in the lobby, demanding to see me. When I refused the meeting, he began shouting loud enough for other tenants to hear, claiming I was heartless and abandoning family in their time of need. Security escorted him out, but he returned the next day, and the day after that. By the fourth day, he'd brought reinforcements. My mother stood in the lobby holding a photograph of me as a child, telling anyone who would listen that her daughter had turned her back on the family that raised her. They'd stationed themselves during lunch hour when foot traffic was highest, maximizing the number of people who witnessed their performance. When building security banned them from the property, they moved to the parking garage. When they were banned from there, they set up across the street with handmade signs reading, "Karen Mitchell, successful businesswoman, failed daughter." The harassment extended beyond my workplace. They somehow got my home address and began parking outside my house at all hours. Sometimes just sitting in their car, sometimes walking up to ring the doorbell repeatedly when I was clearly home but not answering. My neighbors, professional people who valued privacy and quiet, were not amused by the disturbance. Mrs. Chen from next door approached me apologetically to say that the situation was making her uncomfortable. And could I please handle it? The final straw came on a Friday evening. I was hosting a small dinner party for potential investors when my parents showed up at my front door, demanding to be let in. They rang the doorbell continuously for 10 minutes, then began pounding on the door and shouting, "Karen, we know you're in there. We can see the cars. How can you entertain strangers while your own parents are suffering?" My guests, sophisticated business people who were considering investing significant money in my firm, sat in my dining room listening to this spectacle. One of them, a venture capitalist named James, quietly asked if I needed to call the police. I excused myself and opened the front door, stepping outside to face my parents on the porch. They looked haggard and desperate, but their eyes held something I recognized from my childhood, the particular rage that came when they weren't getting their way. "This ends now," I said quietly. "You're harassing me at work, at home, and now you're disrupting my business meetings. This is stalking, and it's going to stop." "We're not stalking you," my father said, his voice shaking with anger. "We're trying to reach our daughter who won't return our calls or acknowledge our existence." "I acknowledged your existence. I met with Alex. I met with Linda. I heard what you had to say, and I made my decision. That should have been the end of it." "The end of it?" My mother's voice rose to near hysteria. "You're our child. You don't get to just cut us off because it's convenient." "Watch me," I replied calmly. That's when my father stepped closer, his face flushed with rage. "You ungrateful little bitch. We gave you life, we raised you, and this is how you repay us? You gave me DNA and 18 years of housing. That's not the same thing as raising me. And you seem to have forgotten that you threw away any claim to gratitude when you abandoned me. We didn't abandon you. We made a hard choice in impossible circumstances. You keep telling yourself that, but we both know the truth. You saved yourselves and sacrificed me, and you'd do it again tomorrow if it served your interests." My mother began crying, loud, theatrical sobs designed to attract attention from the neighbors. "How can you be so cruel? We're old, we're sick, we're struggling, and our own daughter won't even help us." "Your daughter is helping you," I said. "She's teaching you the same lesson you taught her, that when people won't or can't help you, you figure it out yourself." That's when my father made his mistake. He grabbed my arm, his grip tight enough to bruise, and pulled me toward him. "You're going to help us, Karen. One way or another, you're going to do right by your family." Behind me, I heard chairs scraping as my dinner guests stood up. James appeared in the doorway, followed by the other investors. "Is everything all right out here?" James asked, his tone making it clear that everything was obviously not all right. My father immediately released my arm and stepped back, realizing he'd just physically threatened me in front of witnesses. Professional witnesses. Wealthy, influential witnesses who could destroy what little remained of their credibility. "Everything's fine," I said. not taking my eyes off my father. My biological relatives were just leaving. The word biological hung in the air like a slap. Not family, not parents. Biological relatives. Karen, please, my mother whispered. We're desperate. I know, I replied. Desperate people do desperate things, which is why I'll be filing for a restraining order on Monday morning. If you come within 500 feet of me, my home, or my business again, you'll be arrested. As they walked back to their car, I heard my father mutter something about lawyers being expensive and teaching me a lesson I won't forget. I turned to my dinner guests, who were standing in my doorway looking shocked and uncomfortable. I apologize for that display, I said calmly. As you may have gathered, I have some family members who are having difficulty accepting boundaries. Shall we return to dinner? The restraining order should have ended it. Judge Morrison listened to my testimony, reviewed the evidence of harassment, and issued a comprehensive order prohibiting my parents and brother from contacting me directly or indirectly, from coming within 500 feet of my home or business, and from posting about me on social media. Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell, the judge said sternly, your daughter is under no legal or moral obligation to provide you with financial support. This court will not tolerate further harassment. Any violation of this order will result in immediate arrest and jail time. I thought that would be sufficient. I was wrong. 2 weeks after the restraining order was issued, my parents were arrested for violating it. They'd been caught on security cameras placing flyers under windshields in my office building's parking garage. The flyers contained my photo and personal information, along with accusations that I was a heartless daughter who abandoned her elderly parents. They spent one night in jail before making bail, and I assumed the reality of legal consequences would finally penetrate their desperation. Again, I was wrong. The violations escalated. They created fake social media accounts to circumvent the prohibition on posting about me. They had Alex's ex-wife call my office pretending to be a potential client, then launch into a tirade about my family abandonment when my assistant connected the call. They hired a billboard company to put up a sign on the highway leading to my office complex reading, Karen Mitchell, when success costs your soul. Each violation resulted in fines, court appearances, and eventually brief jail sentences. But they seemed to view legal consequences as merely the cost of doing business in their campaign to force me into compliance. The breaking point came when they involved my employees. My assistant, Jennifer, had worked for me for 3 years. She was professional, discreet, and fiercely loyal to both me and the business. When she didn't show up for work on a Tuesday morning, I called her cell phone repeatedly with no answer. Finally, she texted me, Karen, I'm so sorry, but I can't come in today. There are people outside my apartment who say they're your parents, and they've been there since 6 a.m. They're scaring my children. I immediately called the police and my attorney, then drove to Jennifer's apartment complex myself. I found my parents sitting in lawn chairs they'd brought from home, positioned directly outside Jennifer's first-floor unit, where her 2 young children could see them through the window. They'd somehow obtained Jennifer's home address, probably through public records tied to her employment verification, and decided that harassing my employees was an acceptable escalation. When I pulled up, they didn't even have the grace to look ashamed. Maybe now you'll talk to us, my father said, standing up from his lawn chair. You're harassing my employee at her home in front of her children. We're trying to get your attention, my mother replied. Since you won't respond to reasonable attempts at communication. Reasonable? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. You think terrorizing innocent people who work for me is reasonable? We think doing whatever it takes to reach our daughter is reasonable, my father said. That's when I realized something fundamental about these people. They genuinely believed that their need justified any behavior, no matter how harmful to others. In their minds, I was the villain for not giving them money, and anyone connected to me was fair game in their war to change my mind. When the police arrived, my parents were arrested again, this time for stalking and harassment of a third party. The charges were more serious and bail was set higher, but the damage was done. Jennifer was visibly shaken. Her children were asking questions she couldn't answer, and she felt unsafe in her own home. She requested a transfer to work remotely for the indefinite future, which I immediately approved along with a security system for her apartment paid for by the company. That evening, I sat in my attorney's office discussing options that went beyond restraining orders. Rachel, they're not responding to legal consequences. They're treating jail time and fines as acceptable costs. What are my options for making this stop permanently? Civil harassment suits, extended restraining orders, possibly criminal charges if we can prove a pattern of stalking, she replied. But Karen, I have to ask, what do you think they'll do if they realize they can't win? What do you mean? Desperate people with nothing left to lose sometimes make dangerous choices. They've already shown they're willing to involve innocent parties like your employee. If they conclude that legal pressure won't work, they might escalate to something more serious. I thought about my father's grip on my arm that night at my house, the rage in his eyes when I refused to comply. I thought about the calculated way they'd researched Jennifer's address and terrorized her children to get to me. You think they might become physically dangerous? I think people who believe they're justified in any behavior to get what they want are inherently unpredictable. And people facing financial ruin with no other options sometimes make desperate choices. That night, I upgraded my home security system, informed my office building's management about the ongoing situation, and arranged for a security consultant to review my daily routines. I was learning that setting boundaries with truly toxic people doesn't make them respect those boundaries. It makes them more creative about violating them. And when creativity fails, some people turn to force. My parents had taught me many lessons over the years, but this was perhaps the most important: that some people would rather destroy what they can't control than accept that it's not theirs to control. The final confrontation happened at my office, but this time I orchestrated it. After months of escalating harassment, arrests, and violations, I realized that my parents would never stop on their own. They'd convinced themselves that persistence would eventually wear me down, that their desperation gave them the right to terrorize me and anyone connected to me. So I decided to end it myself. I had my attorney arrange a meeting under controlled conditions: my office conference room, my security, my recording equipment, and my rules. I told them through their court-appointed lawyer that I would meet with them one final time to discuss their requests, but only under these specific circumstances. They agreed immediately, probably thinking they'd finally broken me down. When they arrived, they looked worse than I'd ever seen them. Months of legal battles, fines, and brief jail stays had taken their toll. My father's face was gaunt, and my mother's hands shook slightly as she sat down across from me. Alex looked defeated, older than his years. "Thank you for agreeing to see us," my mother began, her voice carrying a mixture of hope and desperation. "Don't thank me yet," I replied. "You might not like what I have to say." For the next hour, they laid out their case: their medical bills, their mortgage payments, their credit card debt, their shrinking Social Security checks. They painted a picture of elderly people facing destitution through no fault of their own. When they finished, I looked at each of them carefully. "I want you to understand something," I said finally. "I feel nothing for you. Not anger, not hatred, not love, not pity. Nothing. You are three people who share some of my DNA, and that's the extent of our relationship." "Karen, we're your family," Alex protested. "No, you're not. You stopped being my family the day you abandoned me. Everything that's happened since then has just confirmed what I learned that day. You are people who will sacrifice others to save yourselves." "We made mistakes," my father said, "but we're trying to make amends." "You're not trying to make amends. You're trying to extract money from someone you perceive as wealthy. If I were still living in poverty, would you be here asking for forgiveness? Would you care about our relationship if I couldn't write you a check?" The silence answered my question. "I know about Alex's second divorce, about his gambling debts. I know about your reverse mortgage and your credit card companies threatening lawsuits. I know exactly how much money you need and why you need it." They looked stunned that I'd researched their situations so thoroughly. "Here's what's going to happen," I continued. "You're going to leave this office and you're never going to contact me again. You're not going to call, email, text, write letters, or send messages through third parties. You're not going to show up at my home or office. You're not going to harass my employees or post about me online. And if we don't," my father asked, some of his old defiance returning, "then I'll destroy you." The words hung in the air like a threat, which is exactly what they were. "You think this has been difficult for you so far? You think some fines and overnight jail stays were hard? I have resources you can't imagine. I have attorneys, investigators, connections, and most importantly, I have patience. I can make your lives infinitely more complicated than they already are." I leaned forward slightly. "But more than that, I simply don't care what happens to you. You taught me not to care when I was 17. That lesson took root and it's never going away. Whether you live comfortably or die in poverty is completely irrelevant to me." "You can't mean that," my mother whispered. "I absolutely mean it. You want to know the difference between us? You need me. I don't need you. You can't hurt me anymore because I don't care about you anymore. But I can hurt you, and I will if you continue to disrupt my life." I stood up, indicating the meeting was over. "This is the last time we'll ever speak. When you leave here today, I want you to forget you ever had a daughter, because I've already forgotten I ever had parents." As they filed out of my office, looking broken and defeated, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, not victory, but a profound sense of completion. The scared 17-year-old girl who had found that note was finally, completely gone. In her place was someone who understood that indifference is the ultimate power over people who have hurt you. When you stop caring what they think, what they need, or what they do, they lose all ability to manipulate or control you. I had become untouchable to them, not because I was angry or vengeful, but because they had made themselves irrelevant to my life. And that indifference, more than any punishment or revenge, was the thing they couldn't fight or overcome. 5 years have passed since that final meeting, and I can tell you with complete certainty that my biological relatives kept their word. I never heard from them again. I know this not because they found peace or acceptance, but because about 2 years later, my private investigator informed me that my father had suffered a stroke and was in a nursing home. My mother was working at a grocery store to pay for his care, and Alex had filed for bankruptcy and moved back in with them. I felt nothing when I received this information. Not satisfaction, not sadness, not guilt, nothing. But let me tell you what happened to the people who actually mattered. Maria from the diner retired and moved to Florida, but we still exchange Christmas cards every year. She was the first person I called when my business was featured in Forbes, and she cried with pride when I told her how well things had turned out. When she needed surgery last year that her insurance wouldn't fully cover, I quietly paid the difference. That's what family does. Big Jim passed away 3 years ago, but not before seeing me speak at a conference for small business owners. He sat in the front row and introduced himself to everyone around him as Karen's old friend from the diner. His funeral was standing room only, filled with people whose lives he'd touched with his kindness and wisdom. Jennifer, my assistant who was harassed by my parents, became my business partner when we expanded into consulting services. She's brilliant, loyal, and raises her children with the same fierce protectiveness that helped her survive that difficult period. Her kids call me Aunt Karen and don't know that their college funds are already fully funded. Mrs. Patterson, my high school guidance counselor, nominated me for an Alumni Achievement Award. When I went back to accept it, she pulled me aside and said, "I always knew you'd be fine, Karen. You had something the other kids didn't. You understood that your circumstances didn't define your possibilities." David, my business partner, became one of the closest friends I've ever had. He knows my whole story and has never once suggested I should forgive my parents or heal the rift in my family. He understands that some relationships are meant to end, and that wisdom lies in knowing the difference between what can be repaired and what should be discarded. I've built a chosen family of people who earned their place in my life through consistency, kindness, and genuine care. We celebrate each other's successes, support each other through difficulties, and show up when we're needed. This is what family actually looks like. My company now employs over 100 people and has helped launch more than 1,000 small businesses. I speak at conferences about entrepreneurship, resilience, and building success from nothing. I never mention my personal story publicly, but I do share one crucial message: that your value is not determined by how others treat you. It's determined by how you treat yourself. The most important lesson I learned from those years of conflict with my biological relatives is this: forgiveness is not mandatory, reconciliation is not necessary for healing, and family is not defined by blood. Some people are born into loving families who support them through everything. Others, like me, have to create their families from the people who choose to love us despite having no obligation to do so. The people who abandoned me taught me that I was disposable to them. The people who stayed taught me that I was valuable to them. I chose to believe the ones who stayed. Today, I woke up in a home filled with photos of people who matter to me: friends, colleagues, mentors who helped shape who I became. I'll spend this evening having dinner with people who chose to be in my life and whom I chose in return. This is what victory looks like. Not revenge against those who hurt you, but a life so full of genuine love and meaningful relationships that their absence becomes irrelevant. I am living proof that you don't owe anyone your forgiveness, your presence, or your resources simply because they share your DNA. You don't owe anyone a relationship that diminishes your peace, threatens your safety, or demands that you set yourself on fire to keep them warm. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is walk away from people who will never value you and toward people who already do. Sometimes the greatest family you'll ever have is the one you build yourself, one person at a time, one choice at a time, one boundary at a time. And sometimes the best thing toxic people can do for you is exactly what mine did for me. They can teach you that you're strong enough to survive without them, capable enough to thrive despite them, and wise enough to know the difference between people who deserve a place in your life and people who don't. My story began with abandonment, but it ends with belonging, real belonging, with people who earned their place and who I earned in return. That 17-year-old girl in the storage unit would be amazed not just by what I built, but by who I built it with, and she would be proud.